Hey there YouTube, and welcome back to the Game Room.
One.
So I want to walk you through the Nintendo Gameplay Counselor Museum exhibit that I put together for the Portland Retro Gaming Expo 2019. But before I do that, I feel like I should catch you up on something important that will explain where I've been lately. As you may know from some of my previous content, my wife Heather has been living with stage 4 breast cancer for the last 4 years. Unfortunately, that battle ended October 18th, the morning of the Portland Retro Gaming Expo. I feel very fortunate to be able to say that it happened as beautifully as something like that can happen. Heather was always so supportive of my love of this hobby and my passion for the history of this industry. In fact, during our last conversation together, she made me promise that I would still go to Portland and put on this museum and host the panel. So really, Heather is the biggest reason why I have something to show you today. This museum display and the associated panel that I'll show you in the next video are a culmination of a year's worth of my life. During that time, it was basically the only thing that I did aside from taking care of my wife. Both the display and the panel were incredibly well received, and the fact that they were, it was so vindicating for me. So to have so much positive feedback on something that I've poured so much of myself into, it just means everything. As I said, the display was a massive success, and I'm going to be able to continue to tour it. The next show it will appear at will be the SoCal Retro Gaming Expo in 2020, so look out for that. Another quick note before we dive into this, big thanks to John Riggs. All this footage is going to be his. I was so excited for the positive response that I kind of forgot to take much footage myself. So there's a link to his channel in the description if you don't already subscribe, and a big thanks to John. Lastly, this display is a living, breathing creature, and it will never stop growing. So, if you're watching this right now, and you are a former Nintendo employee from the Counselor era, and you would like to contribute artifacts or stories to this exhibit, please reach out to me. I will put my contact information in the description. Know that anything that changes hands between us will be kept completely confidential, it will be in a forever home, and it will be archived, shared, and loved. Having said all that, let's look at the display.
Alright, so before we begin, I just want to take a second to say thank you to Kelsey Lewin and Frank Cifaldi of the Video Game History Foundation. They sponsored the museum this year at Portland Retro Gaming Expo, and they graciously asked me to be a part of it. So I really appreciate it. I think it turned out great again, and so yeah, thanks to both of them, and if you don't already donate to the Video Game History Foundation, please consider it. So my display was actually just a one wall of a larger room. There were several other displays involved, but my display takes up this entire wall, so from corner to corner of this wall is all Gameplay Counselor stuff. So I'll start talking about things as we go from left to right here. First up, we actually have Gameplay Counselor jackets. These are all owned by Gameplay Counselors. In fact, everything here, except for a couple pieces which I will call out as placeholder, are from Gameplay Counselors originally. So these 5 jackets of the 6 jackets that I have, one is elsewhere in the exhibit, were all given to Gameplay Counselors. The one on the far left is actually a cross-training jacket, so there were several different disciplines within customer service that you could master, and as you did, you would get rewarded with various items. The Advanced Super Agent was cross-trained in correspondence, gameplay counseling, and technical support. Most of the other jackets here were just assigned to Gameplay Counselors when they were hired, save for the Superpower 92 jacket, which was an event jacket worn by counselors who staffed the event. So let's stop here for a second. I do want to acknowledge that some of the things in this display are really normal, everyday Nintendo items, but the fact that they were just used by counselors makes them special. These desk reference Nintendo powers, for instance, they're 100% regular Nintendo powers, except for those desk tags on them, and those really denoted which desk they were at. So sometimes counselors would be packed 2 to 3 per desk for different shifts, morning, swing, and evening shift, and so they would have to share resources, and in this case, they shared their sets of Nintendo powers, and yes, they did use Nintendo powers from time to time. They didn't completely rely on information that they generated themselves. Also pictured here is a receipt from an internal Nintendo employee sale of that game atlas that's right there. And one of my favorite things in this display case is that gameplay counselor training manual. It's just, again, a tips and tactics for Zelda, but that particular piece was used in the training of gameplay counselors. One more thing that I wanted to point out in this screenshot are the hand-drawn Lufia 2 maps. So later in this display, you'll see map books that the gameplay counselors used to take calls. But sometimes they didn't have maps for a game that they were looking for, or maps hadn't been generated yet, and they had to be drawn by hand. So those particular Lufia 2 maps in my sets of manuals were drawn by hand. Oh, this is another really great place to stop. So that Metroid Express jersey, that is a basketball jersey from an early gameplay counselor internal Nintendo basketball team. And the story that I've been told is that at one point they were playing in pub leagues around town, but the local kids caught wind and started showing up to their games in droves. And so they were eventually asked politely to stop playing in the public leagues. But that's one of my favorite pieces, and it's just so cool. It's named Metroid Express. I just love everything about it. So before we go on, also in this case is a Nintendo Employee Handbook from 1994, I think. A whole bunch of library carts are also in this display case. So Nintendo had an internal game library of every licensed Nintendo game. This was used by gameplay counselors and by Team Nintendo and basically anyone who needed a copy of a game. So if you ever see these particular barcodes on the fronts of games, you may want to think twice about removing them. I do see a lot of cartridges that come from Seattle area stores that do have them removed, and it makes me real sad. You're not going to get a huge premium for them. Only select few people really care about them enough to pay extra. Unless you're doing something like this, like putting together a gameplay counselor museum. But they are neat little pieces of history. Speaking of neat little pieces of history, I think the other thing that I would point out in this display case is the I Survived Dragon Warrior button. So the Dragon Warrior, Million Dragon Warrior giveaway, where Nintendo gave away a copy of Dragon Warrior to every single Nintendo Power subscriber at the time. That was really difficult on the gameplay counselors. And so at the end of that, one of the counselors drew this piece of art with a counselor being burned to a crisp by flame coming out of their monitor. So pictured there is actually the button that has that picture, and then it says "I Survived Dragon Warrior" on the bottom. But I also acquired the original art for that button, so that accompanies it as well. This one seems to be oddly polarizing. People either think it's the coolest thing ever, or they're not really that impressed. So this is a piece of one of the original call center buildings. In 2010, I want to say, they demolished one of the original call center buildings, and when they did, they saved out 2 large pieces and had Reggie Fils-Aimé and his executive team sign them, and they auctioned them off internally to Nintendo employees, and I just happened across one of the Nintendo employees that won that auction. So that is a physical piece of a original Nintendo campus building where the call center was that does not exist anymore. And for me, that's a really important piece of history, and some people just think it's a rock. So you can make your own judgments. The rest of the things in this display case are mainly various awards for gameplay counselors. So the obelisk you see with the Mario 2 Mario on the top was the award given for Super Agent, and that was when you were cross-trained as a gameplay counselor and as technical support. The award next to it, in back there, is an award of excellence, which was sort of a catch-all award. I've seen it awarded for retirement awards or just for doing a good job at something. I also don't think it was exclusive to gameplay counselors, so I believe any Nintendo employee could get that as an award, but don't quote me on that. In front of it is a small paperweight that was awarded, I believe, for a certain level of gameplay counselor. I don't remember which I think it was 3. Below that, on the next shelf there, is a crystal clock that was given for 10 years of service at Nintendo. Those are no longer awarded. And then below that is the 20-year service award. Those are very, very difficult to come by, as most people who spent 20 years at Nintendo don't particularly want to give them up. So, and I'm super, super not pushy about this kind of stuff. So if people say, hey, I'm not really interested in selling that, I don't push. And so this time I got lucky, and the gentleman did indeed want to sell his 20-year award to me. So yeah, I'm super happy to have it and be able to show it to people, because it really doesn't come up very often. And so we come to what I believe is the primary piece of this exhibit, the star attraction, if you will. So I tried, within the best of my ability, using conference tables instead of cubicles, to approximate the workspace of a gameplay counselor. And I've gotten feedback from everyone from Howard Phillips to my panelists. Everyone says that I did a pretty darn good job, considering I had to use tables instead of a cube. Everything you see here, aside from the NES, because I had forgotten mine at home and I needed to buy one real quick for the display, and those green binders, I was just using those as placeholders for the binders that originally I was going to have the blue binders there in the display cases, but I didn't have enough display cases to do that, so my plan was to have the placeholder binders there, and then you can go look at the real ones. But I ended up not having enough display cases for those binders, so they just went out on the tables. So I just had these extra green binders. So those green binders and the NES are not from Gameplay Counselors originally. Everything else on this table is. So there's a lot to unpack in this shot. So the television, the telephone, the Super Nintendo, the Advantage, the mug, all of those, the Game Boy, all of those were actually on Gameplay Counselor desks at one point in time. There's some really, really interesting tiny things that I just love about this desk. The Super Nintendo sipper bottle, or the desk ergonomics card, or the Star Fox's fan art, essentially, which was one of my favorite pieces, and actually a lot of people commented on them positively. Those were just from an internal art contest at Nintendo at the time, and just to have little pieces like this to make a desk like this feel so lived in, I was really excited about. Another piece that I love there is the small Elmo on top of the TV. So the digital repository of Gameplay Counselor information, when they moved from the binders to a more digital era, the acronym for that database was Elmo, and so obviously the Nintendo wouldn't let them make official swag for Elmo because it's a copyrighted name. So they ended up starting to buy little Sesame Street toys and putting them on their desks, and that particular Elmo was on the desk of a Gameplay Counselor. I'm just so proud of this exhibit, and to be able to, have a setup like this and say, yes, everything here was from a Gameplay Counselor desk. It was just so important to me, and it's just so awesome that I got such good feedback on it. You'll see the 6th jacket there, the gray Metroid jacket. So those were the first ones that were issued to Gameplay Counselors. So I chose to have that one at the desk instead of on display with the rest of the jackets. Lastly, let's talk about the items here that sort of glue the entire display together, and that would be the Nintendo Gameplay Counselor binders. So the information that the counselors used to take calls wasn't generated by the developers or the publishers. A lot of that was developed by the Gameplay Counselors themselves. In their downtime between calls, or in dedicated time, they would play games. There was even an entrance exam to become a Gameplay Counselor, right? So you had to be able to master, the most popular games at the time before they'd even let you get on the phones. So the binders you see here are really the knowledge share of the gameplay counselors as a team. Nintendo would issue the binders, and then it would be kind of up to the gameplay counselors to fill in the blanks. Most of these are just maps, but some of the more intricate things, like where things were or walkthroughs, would be up to the counselors to create themselves. As I mentioned earlier, in the display case, some games didn't even have maps, and the counselors would have to draw them by hand. Drawing maps was also a favorite activity for some of the counselors as an excuse to get off the phones or take fewer phone calls. So a lot of them poured a lot of time, effort, and energy into these maps, and they're extremely detailed. This is the most complete set that I have found together, but even then I know that, as they would phase things out or different counselors would specialize in different games, the binders would change. So this set doesn't have some of the earlier stuff, like I know it's missing Punch-Out and it's missing the original Super Mario Brothers. So the really early stuff, it isn't represented here. I'm likely going to do a video specifically on these binders at some point, because there is a ton of content to go over. But in the meantime, Metal Jesus Rocks actually has a video in which he discovered, or a friend of his discovered, one of the binders, and he walks you through it pretty thoroughly. So if you'd like to get a better look at the binders in the meantime, head over to his channel and check out that video. I think that's going to about do it for this tour of my Gameplay Counselor Museum. As I said before, this is an ever-growing, ever-changing display. In fact, as I'm recording this, I already have a number of things that will be included at the SoCal Retro Gaming Expo when it's shown again that are not represented here. So yeah, every time you see it, it should be a little bit different, and I'm excited for that. But anyway, yeah, thank you for letting me walk you through this.
So that's going to about do it for this episode. I realize it was kind of a fly-through, but I was using someone else's footage that wasn't made for this purpose. I promise next time I will do better at documenting the display. As I mentioned, the next video will be the Gameplay Counselor panel, which I'm super excited to show you, but that's a 45-minute panel, so I didn't want to squish the two together. Thank you so much for your continued support. I'll see you later.